I'm Hugh Weber. I'm the managing director here at Design Observer. For those of you that aren't familiar with Design Observer, it was founded in 2003 by Jessica Helfand, Michael Bierut, Rick Pointer, and Bill Drentel as a collaborative platform intentionally for conversations like this. So while they used to look like threaded forums and conversation groups, at some point they looked like actual in-person events, shocking as that might seem today, and podcasts. Today they look like this space, the Design Observer Studio Sessions, a space that's been crafted and curated for you and for this conversation. I become your voice in a lot of ways throughout the course of this 90 minutes. So if you have questions, let's put them in the chat. Let's make sure they stay, that stays engaged as well. And I'll jump in and interrupt and ask those questions on your behalf. But I think without further ado, it's time to get started. Another Design Observer Studio Sessions. We actually have some 5-timers on our call today, which is pretty exciting. They are completists. They are not going to miss a Saturday session with us. So welcome to those folks and to those of you that are here for the first time. But it's my privilege to be able to pass things on to our co-host and co-founder, Jessica Helfand.
Thank you, Hugh, and thank you for such a generous welcome to those of you who are here for the first time and back for a second, third, fourth, and fifth time. Thank you also for coming. We are all over the world right now. I'm in California. We've got people on the East Coast. We've got a lot of people, I think, from Europe today. I welcome everybody, and thank you. I know Zoom fatigue is real. It's upon everybody, and so we especially are appreciative of the time you're making for this conversation. And what I want to say, you know, Design Observer's been around for 17 years. And we started out trying to have conversations online. And as Hugh just said, this is exactly that kind of conversation with this now new technology. But one of the things I'm seeing right now, 6 weeks into this, and I'm speaking from California, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, was the first state to issue a stay-at-home order, that emotions are frayed and frustration is real. The struggle, as it turns out, really is real. We're hearing about people fighting. We're hearing about people crying. I mentioned to someone recently, what's good for public health isn't necessarily good for mental health, for individual understanding of where we are in this moment. And so we come together as a community in this conversation because we are dealing with all this on our own. So I really look forward to these moments, to have these sorts of, this kind of time to actually delve into this a little bit. And I can't imagine two more perfect people to have that conversation with us today than Anil Dash and Anna Weiner. And we will get into this in a moment. But both of them, I think, are particularly brave in their work and in their willingness to speak about their work and their willingness to share their work that is at turns personal and difficult. And I think incredibly enlightening because they're willing to make it public in a way that feels so authentic and real. And I know that word is overused, but I think in their case, it's not at all overused. So I think the timing of this conversation could not be better. And the person we have to thank for that is Michael Bierut, whose suggestion it was to pair them. And they both said yes. So we're really, really happy about that. And before we get into it, I'm just going to ask Michael if you have anything to add about this moment for you.
Yeah, Jessica, I think that it's, you know, it's apropos that we're talking to Anna and Anil today, because one of the things that I wonder is, I mean, you mentioned Zoom fatigue, and, you know, I think like many other people, I've both been struck by how, you know, how technology has enabled so many, you know, so much to still kind of carry on, including your ability to watch shows on, you know, watch shows on television, call remote people on the phone, and do things like this, look at people through this mysterious and what was to me always kind of a unpleasant default way of talking to people. 60 or so days ago, I sort of just, this is my least favorite way to meet people. I just thought it was, you know, to have a meeting. And now it's all I do every day, Monday through Friday. And, you know, it has a kind of brutal efficiency where you don't even have to get up and go to another room. You don't have to, you know, leave your house and go to meet with someone face to face, or decide on a place to meet, or settle into your chairs. You simply kind of like leave one meeting and then enter the code for the next meeting, and there you go. And if you have someone efficient scheduling your time, you can just do one after another all day long. And at the end of it, you sort of really do feel exhausted in a way that I've never been exhausted before. And I take pains to say all that, acknowledging the fact that my complaints are rather self-centered, pathetic, and, you know, there'd be plenty of people who'd be delighted to be exhausted just having, you know, supposedly productive meetings on platforms like Zoom. But, you know, and instead they're worried about, you know, taking care of someone who's sick or where their next meal is going to come from. So I acknowledge all that. These are definitely problems that come with privilege. But it does kind of raise a question that I think we'll get into with our guests. It just has to do with, you know, the completely transformed role that technology is playing in everyone's lives now, whether or not you're stuck on these kind of meetings all day long, or whether or not you're simply being shaped by forces that in some ways are being determined by our ability to gather data about infection rates and recovery rates and in death rates and things like that, all of which, you know, are, I find myself thinking back to the pandemic of 1918, although I find myself thinking of saying it's 1917 all the time because our president and his misspeaks kind of have gotten into my head. But it's the pandemic of 1918, which couldn't have been tracked with the appearance of precision that the technology now gives us, although I think we learn all the time that seeming precision down to the last you know, ones column in the counts of various things is often illusory and inaccurate and everything else. So you know, as I was sort of like settling in for this conversation, I remembered a part of Anna's book, Uncanny Valley, that we'll be talking about with her, where she says she's talking about you know, one of her jobs, and said basically I work for home and I very seldom went into the office during that part. And I remember thinking, oh, I could never do that. You know, I'm just not that kind of person. I could not function that way. And yet you find out, you know, that whether you want to or not, you've got to learn a new way to function. So I think one of the things that we can really get into is, you know, with the brilliant people we've got to talk to today, you know, what does it mean if all of us are really, you know, have become even more reliant in many ways on technology that we have to acknowledge has flaws, limitations, biases, all these other things. So I think that's going to be an interesting conversation. I've been looking forward to it all week. I'll be frank and I'll say that as soon as we wrapped it up last 2 weeks ago, we completed our last conversation. Me, Jessica, Hugh, and our producer Blake stayed on and said, who would we like to have next time? And we said, what if we got Anil Dash and Anna Weiner? And you know, sometimes that's sort of your starting point, and then you figure out who's available, who says yes. And instead, they both said yes. And so it's a dream come true.
So I think we should start with Anil.
Yeah.
Michael, would you like to introduce Anil?
Absolutely. So Anil Dash is someone who I remember, I believe, like when I first, you know, I mean, Design Observer started as a blog, but Anil has been, you know, working as a voice in platforms like that as long as I can remember. I remember when I first joined Twitter, one of the I have this weird memory of like literally the very first tweet I may have read might have been from him. And so I just have this like association with him and his voice as transmitted over platforms like blogs and social media as something that really has been consistently participating in and looking at the world of online discourse, and you know, for good, for ill, as a you know, interestingly enough, not as you know, a straight up cheerleader, which is just so common to find among people who work within the world of tech. They just sort of almost have to define themselves as people who are, you know, just there to kind of cheerlead for and defend against anyone sort of like criticizing. Instead, he's been as smart a critic and as incisive an observer of the online world in which we find ourselves for like literally as long as anyone has been thinking about these things. He's currently the CEO of Glitch, which is I think I'll let him talk about it, but I think it's very much the embodiment of what he thinks the internet can be, and a way to kind of like push technology in a direction that reflects some of his values. So I think with that as an introduction, I'd like to just invite us all to welcome Anil to the conversation, and we're just glad to have you here.
Michael, thanks so much, and Jessica too. It's a very kind way to say that I'm old enough that we've been on the internet forever. So thank you for that.
Since the last century, yeah.
Obviously your work and reputation precedes you, but the first interaction I do recall us having was, this is ancient history for a lot of people, but the early days of blogs, the team I was on had built some of the first tools, and, people were using them to build, in those times, Gawker or Huffington Post or things like that. And I literally remember being in the office. I was on a trip out to San Francisco, even though I'm based in New York, and seeing the first version of Design Observer on the screen, using the tools. We built a tool called Movable Type, and just like bouncing up and down on my seat, like, wow, like really, like people who really have a real career in the real world are using this thing. It was a very validating moment. I remember very distinctly, and still feel that way. So thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I think the last time, the last time I physically saw you speaking was at the AIGA conference, and you gave this great talk that had to do sort of with what went wrong with the way we thought it was going to go. Can you sort of like describe the thesis as it stood then, and maybe what has, what you think about it now?
You very charitably described me as being more of a critic than a cheerleader, but I would say the first, call it decade of my career building online platforms, I was a cheerleader. I had a title that used to be in vogue in Silicon Valley back then of chief evangelist, like that was a thing. And, well, for some of the younger folks might find this hard to believe, there was a point when you would have a job that was going to tell people that social media will exist and you should try it. And that was largely my job for several years. And I was something of a Pollyanna, right? Oh, if you give everybody a voice, we're going to hear, the very positive, true part. They're going to hear all these underrepresented voices and people who couldn't get past the gatekeepers and people who otherwise wouldn't have a platform. And smart, well-intentioned, thoughtful people would say, well, what about somebody that's sharing misinformation? What about somebody who is trying to manipulate the media? What about somebody who is spreading lies? Say, oh, no, it'll self-correct. People will share their corrections. And so I was that person. I was absolutely the uncritical evangelist, right? And I think it's interesting to use a religious term, right, as sort of a evocative religion, because I think we did have the zealotry of the recent convert about it. And so from there, that the first tools we built were, sort of succeeded beyond wildest imagination, right? To have design thinkers of your caliber and people in other disciplines using these tools and sharing ideas that they wouldn't have a place for was like, this is the promise. This is what the exalted use. And it wasn't until a couple of years later that we start, and that was actually the first wave that it proved out in the beginning. So we sort of said, oh, it is working. And then shortly thereafter, another platform that people of sufficient vintage might recall was LiveJournal. That was one of the other tools that we ran under the company I was at. And they basically had the first social network that reached 10 million users. And it was the sort of stereotype, which wasn't entirely false, was like, really emo teenagers sharing their feelings, which I think is a valuable thing. It was certainly a predecessor to Tumblr later and some of the other stuff that's come along. And we saw the nascent forms of today, what we recognize as systematic harassment and organized targeting and sharing of misinformation. We saw the template to everything that is now played out at a global scale. And we're insufficiently reactive to it. It was dismissed as, oh, there's always going to be some bad guys in the room and you can just block them, you can turn it off. And it was the same, unfortunately, we see the same pattern repeated over and over to this point where now the people running the biggest, the platforms that have 2 billion people on them, have the same naivete that we had 20 years ago, you know. And in our case, I think, I don't excuse it, but I'm like, well, nobody's ever done this before. Nobody's ever had 1 million people on a platform before is a pretty good excuse for not knowing what will happen. I think, you know, now to say some of the people who are executives running this stuff were born after the first social networks were created, and sort of born into that world, and to sort of, you know, plead naivete or ignorance is a, and especially when we've seen so much harm caused, is a different thing. And then that sort of galvanized me into saying, I think for a long time I thought, I'm going to write a think piece on Medium and that's going to fix things, right? And that was sort of the same naivete, right? It's sort of the same problem of thinking, oh, you put your opinion out on social media and the real world is going to change, right?
Yeah,
and
but
so,
what's interesting to me about that, Anil, is that, I mean, part of what interests us at Design Observer is having conversations about design that are about a bigger world, or how they impact a bigger world, or how we thread the needle in a different way. And even in talking about Medium, it's you putting something out there through some different vehicle or lens. I read in your bio that you're the only person to have ever been retweeted by Bill Gates, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Prince, which is hilarious. But it also speaks to this sort of diversification.
That's my triangulation.
It's really, it's all we need to know, I suppose, about you. But it actually speaks to this, I think, what you're talking about, which is like, how do you get out of that bubble and out of that feedback loop, if not by trying to have conversations in different ways, at different moments, with different people?
No, I think that's fair. I mean, you do have to have a grounding, right? Like I try to have an intellectual grounding or a framework, and I love writing, and I will never stop, you know, putting my, you know, updating my blog or whatever it is, like putting the context out there, because I think it does form the groundwork for the conversation. What I think has evolved for me is the theory of change about tech and the tech industry in particular, right? Which was that I thought, you know, I'm going to make this well-formed argument with good evidence that we could have this problem. And that is an approach that actually works for if you report a security bug, you know, yeah, okay, yes, my app has this problem, we'll fix it, we've got it tracked, or if it's urgent, we'll react to it. And so I was a coder and engineer for many years. And so I sort of thought, okay, well, I filed a bug report. And in this case, it's that we're going to be able to manipulate elections, and bad actors are going to cause misinformation to spread online and people will be harmed. And then they're going to fix the bug. And it doesn't fit that, right? There's these things where there are other interests, or their lack of familiarity and context, or them overtly not caring about the problems being identified. That part is what changed. And so I thought, you know, it's necessary but not sufficient to talk about the problems, to write about the problems. But then the theory of change has to involve some kind of action. And to me, what I found is, if I were a critic, I was dismissed. If I was, I worked in the policy world for several years, that gets dismissed. Tech has this immune response that is just incredibly powerful. And the only thing that can pierce that is if you are perceived or read as essentially a founder, right? If you have a product that succeeds and you present like, you know, in some kind of Steve Jobs archetype or whatever, you're the genius in the garage or something, then you're allowed to say whatever you want, and you'll be heard. And it's a huge structural flaw, because only a very limited number of kinds of people get to do that. But I thought this approach might be useful. And then that merged with the fact that, you know, I now work with a team that actually, you know, we didn't create a company as a critique of tech. We created a company because there was something we think should exist in the world. But the fact that those pieces can merge, I think, was really powerful.
There's plenty to say about that. And I know that, you know, in Anna's writing and in her book, it's like she sort of describes that culture in a way that is just so vivid and so believable, and we'll get into it then. I want to ask you a question that actually occurred to me as you were describing that, you know, that journey from the early halcyon days where it was just all so optimistic, to the realization that things could go wrong, but it could be contained, to, you know, maybe it's worse than that. And to what degree is the technologies that we're talking about and the access that people have and the ability to spread this information, to what degree is it simply exposing and providing platforms for people that are bad, you know, however you want to define it? And to what degree is it, for lack of a clever way to say it, to what degree is it actually making them bad?
That's a key question. And my argument for the first half of my career was These behaviors have already existed. I mean, to take the extreme example, there's always been, Nazis around, and we're just seeing them, and that makes it terrible. And
or even with sunlight being the disinfectant, maybe seeing them is good, and then the massive smart voices in the room will kind of shame the Nazis away.
And that was the naive assumption that I started with, and it turns out that sunlight is also what makes weeds grow.
Mm-hmm.
And what we come out of this with is, and the best example of this I would say is the platforms where an algorithm decides what you see. So you've all been on YouTube, you watch a video and it says you're going to like this thing next, right? And in my case, I'm nerding out about music production gear, vintage music production. It's actually amazing. It's great. I'm going to go deeper and deeper into this area that I'm obsessed in. Two things were unanticipated, though, in that model of putting things in front of people. And this is true of the Facebook algorithm, YouTube, like all these platforms. I think one was that that works for sort of neutral topics. But when you go deeper dive into an obscure topic, if that topic is about something that is harmful, that's actually radicalization, right? Yeah. You need a more hardcore stuff every time in order to get that same emotional reaction to click. The other part that they didn't anticipate, which I'm sort of obsessed with, is when you build algorithms that have monetary value and cultural value, people will reverse engineer them. And this is like such a prosaic example, but I love this one, which is, how many of us have seen, I come from a small town in Pennsylvania, it was 2,000 people when I was growing up. And yet we had AAA plumbers, right? And it was like, if your drain was clogged, this is who you'd call. And the reason why was the algorithm of the phone book. They would be listed first in the yellow pages, and that had economic value because otherwise you had to buy a yellow pages ad, right? So we have a predecessor, pre-digital, pre-internet, pre-computers, all this thing, which was like, why are you A1 towing?
Alphabetical order was the original algorithm, yeah.
Exactly, right? Yeah. And so you've always had people reverse engineering an algorithm. So of course, when there was, and that was only just to become the top tow truck driver in a small town in rural Pennsylvania, right? And if you go backwards from that, and you sort of say that is the practice and the behavior, then we have 20 years of this behavior iterating. Around the time that Design Observer started was the rise of what's now called search engine optimization, or SEO. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry. But people are just figuring out, if you put the title on the page this way and you make a web page look like this, Google likes you. And Google wasn't even the dominant search engine yet. People are like, well, that's nice. Otherwise, I'd have to buy an ad.
Okay.
That behavior trained an entire generation. And it's innate. It's intuitive. They don't even, there are folk remedies on Instagram about what the algorithm likes and what we'll do to promote, right? And so wear this color, have your background look like this. And so like the homogeneity of flat lays on Instagram is a culture responding to, like, there is a, almost a cargo cult. We don't know what we have to sacrifice to Mark Zuckerberg to make our Instagram photos popular, but we will try, right? It's like, and if it's not sacrificing goat, but it's looking like this,
yeah,
then we will do that. And so that there's a really positive human impulse about desire for affirmation, reflection, confirmation, all those things that come from that is very human and understandable. But then if you understand that there are bad actors and there is algorithm content that people can figure out how to share to promote, and that there is an engine of radicalization because you're pulling people into more and more extreme content. And if it's, extreme car repair, so what? If it's extreme views on race, big deal. Then somebody working backwards from that is going to say, how do I create content to target people? And no, it's not going to be everybody. It's never going to be on the homepage of YouTube. But anybody who curiously looks up, what did they mean by that term? When somebody, for example, one of the memes that was created specifically to target that behavior, many of you have heard of the phrase incel, right? It's an involuntary, involuntarily celibate person. That was a phrase that they wanted to have be weird enough, new enough that people would Google it, and then spam all of the content on YouTube, on Reddit, on all the other platforms to be by people trying to recruit into the community. So that the first thing you would see of somebody explaining, what does this phrase mean? What does this term mean? Is induction and sort of filtering people in. And that is a behavior Mark Zuckerberg still to this day does not understand that is the way those things work.
Yeah.
But this is behavioral science in a kind of interesting way. I mean, as you're talking,
very much so.
I'm thinking, I'm starting to see the world, because I'm living a life of extreme isolation, as we all are. I'm starting to see the world as like one big Greek tragedy. And so in standard Greek tragedy, the chorus.
Can't disagree.
The chorus was there to come explain to you what you did not understand, right? And so I find myself thinking, I used to think the chorus were all the people retweeting. I used to think the chorus were all the people just liking bullshit. now I'm thinking the chorus might be the algorithms. When I'm listening to you speak, it's like, who's the they behind all of this?
And that's especially true because the chorus is often an echo, right? And in Greek tragedy, the chorus is often amplifying, highlighting a thing you just heard and
Right.
contextualizing, right? And the algorithm is doing that because the way that we abdicate responsibility when we build tech platforms is by saying, well, the algorithm did it. It's not our fault. The algorithm did it. It's like, well, who made the algorithm? But you are seeing more of that thing because you clicked on the thing. It's your fault, right?
Yep.
It's like, well, yes, but the fact that you are amplifying what I clicked on and being that chorus and like the chorus is omniscient, right? You have this sort of context. It gives you a higher responsibility. So shouldn't you be narrating a vision of this that perhaps leads more to comedy than tragedy?
So in your current role, it sounds like you deliberately realized that you had to found an enterprise to sort of, to do what a Medium article couldn't do. It's one thing to just kind of have opinions, another thing to actually say, I'm gonna put capital and put a lot at stake in a business to sort of like prove out what I believe. Is that what Glitch is basically?
That's overstatement. So there's a whole team that was creating what's there. I wish I had that degree of forethought and incoherence to what I do. What I would sort of say is there already is a community and a context of people trying to make things that are thoughtful in the world. There always was. And the internet has always had that. Making that visible in a form that's legible as a startup is part of the project, right? And so what I look at in this case, I had worked with the founders of our company, actually, two really thoughtful guys, Joel Spolsky and Michael Pryor, and they had started the companies under another name, Fog Creek Software, actually 20 years ago. And they built a number of things over the years. Probably the best known for this audience would be Trello, which is a project management tool. They spun that out. And so they built a series of things, none of which relied on surveillance of your data, none of which had algorithms doing creepy things to you. None of, like they were thoughtful platforms, and there are lots of tools like this. And so I'd kept in touch with them over the years, and they, through the same process, they'd always been building products. They'd built a prototype of what became Glitch, and it was a tool for building apps on the web, And which is interesting on its own technically. I mean, the fact that you can, I think for the same reasons, like a lot of us, I really love Figma and tools like that, where there's sort of real-time collaboration. I think is well, as we're discovering with video, it's different in kind. It is a different process than sitting down with somebody, but it is something that is viscerally human and interactive and I think emotional in a lot of ways. Like to create with somebody is very intimate and personal. And I never felt I had that in writing code and software. And so I think that's sort of what we capture in Glitch is what you do in Google Docs writing together, what you do in Figma designing together, we do in coding together in Glitch. And I thought that was interesting. And then I thought, well, what if this were a community and the output of what you create, which is an app, were social? Because I look at where I discover whatever, an interesting video is on YouTube, for better or worse, where I discover, a great photo is probably on Instagram, for better or worse. But apps are purely commercial, right? If you go to the Apple App Store, most of the time, I find like, and this might be because I have a 9-year-old son, they'll have like a game that's tied to some comic book movie and has a bunch of like in-app purchases if you want to play the game. It's like, this doesn't make my heart sing. And yet I knew an internet made by people. This is not ancient history. Like MySpace, really is only 10 years ago at this point. You had tens of millions of people making the web for themselves. And in this moment where like probably 70% of you have baked your no-knead, sourdough at home, think about, if all we have is factory farm fast food, like sometimes you got to have that. But if all you have is that, you're going to feel pretty bad. And so we reflexively go to home cooked, locally made, connected to our tradition, or ingredients that we can identify that are probably organic food, right? And we think of the great memories of our lives are often a meal that we have with people that we love. And if we take the tech analogy to this sort of food analogy, we sort of say our phones are full of the factory farm fast food. We know it. And then how many apps on your phone or how many tabs in your browser are apps, websites, whatever, made by a person in your community or whom you know or who you know their values that is connected to you? And that question has haunted me for years. And Glitch was a team that was already working on solving that. They just didn't contextualize it that way. And so building a community around that was really like, when I came in and we said, what does it take to have that be true and not just be, creators of the web are these few cohort of programmers in Silicon Valley, but rather the web is a medium. And humans will, whatever, you lock a human in a cave and they will take 2 sticks and make music because they can't stop doing it. And so just like we are driven to sing, and we're driven to take photos, and we're driven to paint, we're driven to create the web, and it is a creative medium. And if you believe that, which a few tens of millions of us do, where would you find that? And where would you see that? And where would you tap into that creative impulse?
Yeah, there is this sort of idea that in fact someone like Mark Zuckerberg has always kind of used as a line of defense, which has to do with the fact that these platforms have an inherent neutrality. They're just tools. They don't, they're tools that people use in different ways, and we want them to use them in good ways, and some people inevitably use them in bad ways. And of course, I think what we learn is that these platforms are not neutral, that they are the product of a bunch of different human choices with different kind of motivations and agendas, and that the people that use them, whether they expect neutrality or not, are actually kind of surrendering to the aggregate of all those choices that others have made. Is one of the things that you think about this new vision of technology, that sense of authorship is more explicit, that you sort of understand kind of the biases and the agendas and the point of view of the things we're encountering online?
Very much so. And part of it is, again, grounding it in a creative context, right? Like, one of my ways I love to nerd out when I'm watching a film is to go on IMDb, while the Netflix thing is playing out, and see, like, what else was that actor in? Or, you have that tickle in your brain, gosh, where did I see her in? And you go and you look it up. And I grew up reading liner notes on albums. I can probably cite chapter and verse from all of my favorite albums, right? And I think this is what creators do, is we are drawn to the people who do the work. Like, one of my heroes was actually a production tour manager in the 70s and 80s, and named Alan Leeds, and he worked for James Brown in the 70s and Prince in the 80s. And I only know his name from liner notes. He was never on stage, right? And so that is what creators do, right? And I think the analog to talking about, painters talk about the price of paint. I think creators talk about the people involved in the creative process a lot of times. And then if you look at the apps on your phone, for which one of those do you know any single person who did anything on them, who did the design, who made that button look the way it does, who wrote the code, who designed the algorithm? And it's not just about accountability of, like, you made a bad algorithm, but also credit, right? Like, who are the people below the line? And what do you lose when they don't get credit? And I think that there are so many analogs that are just revealed to us when all we do is look at every other creative medium, and we say, that surprise, that delight you get, and saying, that same person that was the same cinematographer who made that other film. No wonder I like it. I would love to have that experience about an app. Gosh, she's back again with another great app. That's amazing. And I don't get to see that.
Yeah. No, it's funny when you say it, because one of the things that struck me when I first kind of started using computers was when you would launch, an app like Photoshop or something. There's a moment at the beginning where they list all these names. And I always it just lists this impossibly long list of names. And I remember saying, this is like the list of people that went to Gatsby's party and The Great Gatsby. It's like all these fantastical people. Who are they? What did they do? What were their lives like? And you really have no idea about that. But on the other hand, I think one of my favorite genres, and I think creative people particularly respond to this, is those moments where you sort of see what was behind the scenes leading up to the creation. And this is a golden age for that. The access to that sort of information is so bountiful that you can sort of find it in so many different ways. And it is a matter of a person whose name you've never heard, who ends up being tremendously consequential to art that you come to love. And particularly in an environment where, like film, like music, like design, it's inherently collaborative. To understand that, even if it just boils down to the fact that Martin Scorsese's a genius, to know that Thelma Schulmeister, his the same, he used the same bunch of craftspeople to kind of shape each of the films. And then I was just listening to a podcast about it was an interview with Barry Sonnenfeld, actually, and I heard for the first time something that I guess was known, that he got called in to be the a cinematographer for like the last 10 days on Goodfellas, because the cinematographer that Scorsese always wanted to work with was on. And so then I immediately went and watched it and tried to figure out, okay, where's the Barry Sonnenfeld moments in that I never before detected in Goodfellas. I had no luck to, figuring out what they were, of course. But on the other hand, I learned all this other interesting stuff when I did that. And so I think it is, and it's amazing how the mythology of Silicon Valley has just been so predicated on, kind of locating authorship in the persona of founders who then, who will generously credit their amazing teams, but somehow the idea that authorship of those teams, and I see this with young designers that I know who have headed off to California to work for big tech companies to find their fortune and to pay off their student loans, will go from being people whose work I could sort of like spot a million miles away, and then I say, what have you been working on? And they just sort of feel like, well, I was helping do this thing that got modified to this other thing that was going to launch, then it got pulled back, then it got launched as another thing, and they just sort of like get a sense of their contribution just being diced and chopped up and kind of dissipated in a way, and the motivation has to be a lot more about money and free snacks then in that case, because you're not getting a sense of your own voice in any of the work you're doing.
Yeah, and I definitely was that person that liked the DVD extras better than the movie. A lot of times, like I could watch infinite footage of somebody in a blue mocap suit with ping pong balls on them. Like, I just think that's the most spellbinding thing in the world, especially for, a lot of Hollywood blockbusters. It probably is better than the movie.
Yep.
But at the same time, there's also the part about how we tell these stories, right? There is no lone genius creator. It is always a collaborative act. And also what it hurts about our imaginations around inclusion and participation, right? Because I think I bet a lot of you, if I say the name Sitharaman Narayanan, will be like, I have seen that. You don't know where. And that is one of the first and longest names on the splash screen to Photoshop when you booted it up in the old versions, right? And so you'll have, if you Google it, and I'll share the spelling if you need to, and what you'll say is like, oh yeah, I don't think I knew it was there, but I knew it was there. For me though, when Photoshop 2.0 came out and had that splash screen, that was representation. I have a cousin named Narayanan. Like, I know this, this is
you saw yourself
on
there.
The screen. Yeah. And the same moment and the same feeling as seeing in a movie, in a book, representation. And so when that was removed, well, we want Photoshop to load faster. Like, I understand the decision-making process. Like, I can imagine the meeting. I know what was written on the whiteboard when that was removed. But I don't think the whiteboard said, and now no teenage kid is going to see themselves as a creator of this app. That was not on that whiteboard.
Yeah.
And our technology shapes Photoshop is a verb, right? That idea, auto-tune is a verb, right? That auto-tune is an algorithm. Yeah. It's just software. And it's wild that it's packaged to a point where it means something in culture. And so we can say like, yeah, oh, that's just tools, it's neutral. It obviously cannot be neutral if it has this cultural weight to the point where we can talk about a software that's just barely a thin UI over an algorithm, as Autotune is a thing that has meaning and culture, right? And so I think that that's something that just sort of comes back over and over and over to me, is like the myth of neutrality. Like, it's never neutral. It's never neutral. And, it is actually a tech illiterate standpoint to say it's neutral. And so the fact that it's being advanced by some of the biggest and most respected names in tech is that they don't know what they are making, or they have an agenda to push something that is false, because those are the only two options.
So let's push a little further in that. This group is more shy than others in that they've been, my private messages are blowing up here. If folks have questions, feel free to continue that way or to share them publicly. But a question you'd mentioned kind of the sense around the way the incel kind of explosion happened and that recruitment happened, that Mark Zuckerberg didn't understand that. The question kind of posed here is it that he doesn't understand it, or doesn't want to understand it, or is kind of willfully kind of choosing to be ignorant about it. Where do you place intent in all of this, Anil? So given that we don't have the liner notes, we look at that kind of founder as the singular voice, or that kind of CEO as singular voice. Where do you place intent?
Intent matters a lot. I'm cautious to ascribe this all to Zuck. I know I'm participating in the sort of great man myth by making him the center of my narrative about the criticism. So I want to acknowledge that. But I think, coming back from that, there are product managers. There are people that make a decision, right? There is someone who says, this is what we're going to do. And I'll take it. Actually, this is a recent, true example, which is there's a known behavior for, again, 15, 20 years on social media of swarming someone. So you sort of hold up a target. If you're high visibility, you hold up a target and you say, everybody go get them, sick them. And it can be, whatever. They have a bad opinion about a movie, but it can be, let's target them on the basis of their identity. It can be a whole range of things. Known behavior, very well documented, and very understandable how you can give people tools to control. And Taylor Lorenz is a great journalist who has written a lot about this. She's at the Times now, and she sort of said offhandedly, and she gets targeted a lot on Instagram because she reports on its culture. She sort of said on Twitter, hey, it'd be great if I could block all the followers of a certain account, not just the account, because when they've chosen to target me, even if I block that individual person, all of their acolytes are going to still come and target me. Which is exactly this pattern, and something that's well understood. And Adam Mosseri, who is in charge of Instagram, had replied to her, and I forget his title, but he's nominal CEO of Instagram within Facebook. He had replied to her and be like, wow, that's a really good idea. And I was furious, honestly. I kind of lost my mind at that response, because I was like, this is me not trying to use too many vulgarities. We are 10 plus years into your platform existing. We are 20 years into knowing this behavior exists. And what actually got me was realizing he's never felt it. He's never been doxxed. He's never been actually targeted. He's never been harassed. And I'm like, I'm someone who, when Gamergate had first started, they had published, our home address. When, every one of these movements, I know, what it is to be targeted. And I realized he's been inside that bubble for so long that it's only an abstraction to him. Yeah. It's not a real threat. And so that, at that point, when you see it and they react to other things, somebody saying you ought to, make this other, move this other button around on the screen, they do react to those things. There is a culpability. There absolutely is. And I look at, there was a recent effort by Avaz, which is these incredible activists working on digital accountability, amongst many other things around the world. They took survivors of misinformation campaigns to Facebook, to Twitter, to the major platforms. And it was a whole range of people. In one case, the most extreme you point at is the Rohingya, where we have a genocide happening in Myanmar because of misinformation being spread primarily on WhatsApp, right? Tens of thousands of people being murdered. That is, you got a buck, right? Yeah. And the minor examples were parents who had lost their 5-year-old children at Sandy Hook, who are still relentlessly, daily, being harassed, tormented by people who have been brainwashed by misinformation online. And Avaz took these people to talk to product managers, not to Mark Zuckerberg, to the people actually in charge of the products. And I think, hopefully, I think it shouldn't take that. I mean, it shouldn't take that much, but I think that is the piece where that's what accountability has got to look like, is that level of people saying the choices you make have this kind of impact on real people's lives. And that it had to escalate to that extreme. I mean, if somebody's already lost their kindergarten-aged child to a mass murder, and they're like, and now I have to go to a product meeting and see you write on the whiteboard or enter into Jira, let's make sure not to torment people whose children are dead. I find it inexcusable. It's very, very hard for me to say, well, they should have, gosh, I'm sorry, next version. That's not in those update notes and in the App Store, when they're like, what we fixed in this version is that. Yeah. And that just makes me, it's very hard for me to be forgiving of it.
Yeah.
I want to, it's going to feel like a real left turn, folks. I want to
ask, please, we can change
the most frequent question, at least 4 of you are really, this is critically important. Anil, what was it that Prince retweeted for you?
Good. I like a lighter topic. He was a really interesting. So he had been extremely online from the beginning. He used to jump in AOL chats with fans in the early '90s, and that was the first interactions I had with him. And even towards the end of his life, he would do live streams that actually worked, in contrast to today's Instagram streams, from his studios. And he would recognize fans in the chat. It was just like this. You have a video chat going, except for the difference was there was incredible music happening instead of me, hectoring you. And so in the chat, he would recognize fans and be like, oh, of course they don't like that guitar solo. They don't like that song. Like, he knew who they were. And so when he interacted with Twitter, I think it was a medium he was sort of born to be as good at as guitar or anything else that he did. He had a really interesting thing he would do where he would quote tweet people's tweets by copying and pasting them. He wouldn't actually embed their thing. And I actually think it was because he understood algorithms so well. He's like, I'm not going to amplify this person so they can get, the bonus for this. I'm going to take this and I'm going to speak to it. So he would sort of quote tweet things. And there were a couple times he did it for me, or with something I'd shared. In his last tour, he had done, this is actually, I hope this gets released someday, this incredible cover of Bob Marley's Waiting in Vain, and a mashup with his own If I Was Your Girlfriend. Just like this incredible, stirring, beautiful thing. Him alone at a piano. And I was like, you got to release that. I mean, incredible. People want to hear this. This is a masterwork. And I was like, well, I'm going to talk to the Marley estate and get permission. I was like, oh, but there's compulsory rights, a music performance, which means you can do a cover version. You don't have to get permission from the artist. And he sort of quote tweets that and is like, this is one of the most heinous things that's ever been inflicted on artists. And really, and I was like, but you did it. You covered the song. Like, I don't get mad at me. You did the thing. And it was great. And it was just such a, it was a really fluent, deeply thoughtful, opining about intellectual property and what it means to be somebody who's created important intellectual property in the world, engaged with as an adult, as a thoughtful person. I think there was such a myth around, he was this wearing lace and riding a unicorn up in Minnesota and living in the clouds. And it was like, no, this was a brilliant businessman, creator, artist who understood the history, especially of how Black artists have been exploited, and had a really strong feeling about how intellectual property was skewed. And that was one of the biggest things. And then another time, he would goof on stuff. I asked him, When Doves Cry was his biggest song. It was created in a single day. He went home to the studio and performed and recorded every voice and every sound on the record. And 6 weeks later, it's a #1 hit. But the thing about it, I said, can you tell us about the night that you recorded it? Like, it's an amazing story. And he quoted it and sort of had this great, it reminded me of the old Peanuts cartoons. He's like, well, it was a dark and stormy night. And then he sort of trailed off. Like, he was sort of and it's such a great, no, you don't get to know how the genius works. Like, it was a very pleasantly dismissive thing.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, I'm gonna throw a curveball here and try something a little different. We've been very visual with our gratitude, but I'm gonna unmute us all you're gonna get 6 seconds, folks, to thank in one crowd cacophony our friend Anil. You're all unmuted. Can you say thank you?
Thank you
so much.
Thank you.
And now I'm going to mute you all again. So I giveth and I taketh away. It's now I would love to pass things to Jessica to introduce Anna. There's going to be kind of more of a group conversation at the end. So please continue to send questions for Anil. But Jessica, would you like to introduce Anna?
I could think of nothing I'd like to do better. In an interview on C-SPAN recently, Anna described her book as the story of Silicon Valley told through the eyes of an ordinary employee. And I completely disagree. There is nothing ordinary about Anna Weiner. An incredible voice, an incredibly honest, original voice. I wanted to say quickly, Tim Belinak, who I'm waving to, hi Tim. When Tim's at Pinterest, he's the design director of Pinterest. When he was at Facebook, he invited me to come out and give a talk to the designers there. And there was this young kid, I was so reminded of this in reading Anna's book. It was a young kid who had just graduated from Yale, and he came up to me after the talk, and he said, I just graduated from Yale, I was a math major, and I joined the design team. And I said, so tell me, what's it like going from rainy, dark, gray New Haven to beautiful Silicon Valley, the sunshine, the free food, what do you think? And he did this. He looked at me, he looked around to make sure nobody was listening, and he said, well, to tell you the truth, it took me a while to get used to all this optimism. And I never forgot it, because it was, as someone who spent most of my adult life on the East Coast, it's a real change up to life on the East Coast. And this is certainly, I think, reflected in Anna's book. For those of you who haven't read it, there are wonderful excerpts online. And maybe I'll ask Blake or Hugh to put some of those excerpts in the chat to whet people's appetites.
Here it is.
Read this marvelous
So the product right there.
The wonderful cover.
Yeah.
And I'd like to begin by asking you, Anna, to talk about something I heard you say in an interview for the New York Times Book Review, in which you described Silicon Valley as an incredibly rich literary subject. Could you talk about that? And I think you have to unmute her, Hugh.
Yeah, happily. Thank you for having me, and thanks to everyone who came. I have to admit, I was so engrossed in what Anil was talking about that I forgot that I was also participating in this. So I just, when you were like giving an intro, my heart started to pound. So I'm acclimating to having attention. Yeah, Silicon Valley is a rich literary subject. I mean, it's all there, right? You have competition, ambition, you have thwarted expectations around every corner. You have young people coming into wealth that they don't know what to do with, young people who didn't really get to experience an adolescence because they were building a business, or that was their adolescence. I don't want to discount that, but didn't have the time or the space to explore in a way that they might have otherwise. You have, I don't know, just like a collision of ambition and avarice and naivete. I just think it's the stuff of literature, but most of the writing about Silicon Valley has really been this kind of, founder worshiping, triumphalist, nonfiction, sweeping narrative about innovation that tends to focus just on a small number of people and on the sort of moral superiority of business. And so I've yet to read, I want to just make sure, there's actually a wonderful novel that I would describe as maybe autofiction, written by a German writer, the name of which I'm blanking on, which is horrible. It's called Seasonal Associate, and it's about her, she's a literary translator, and it's, I think, a thinly veiled account of her time working at an Amazon warehouse. And it's fabulous, and it's slow, and it's sort of tedious, but in a way that I think is deliberate and reflects the work that she's doing. And I think we're starting to see literary treatments of this world, but historically it hasn't really been, considered as such. So I don't know if that gets at the heart of your question.
And I think what I'm so fascinated with is the idea of someone, well, many things, first of which is a very young person writing a memoir. A memoir is sometimes a genre we think of for somebody much older. But you did this with a mixture of journalistic integrity and observation, and also you went there. You were personal. And I've been thinking about this so much. I said earlier that both you and Anil are brave writers. Anil, you've written about your struggles with depression. I think sometimes, particularly in the design profession, it's a very shiny, pretty, perfect world that we're meant to be contributing to. And I find so meaningful the writing and the observation that goes into making your own story personal, but also how that becomes universal. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to what led you to the moment of realizing, and how the work was gathering your own insights and doing the research for a story that could be both personal and public.
Yeah, that's a good question. Memoir, I would say, is not a genre that I have ever been particularly inclined to write in. I wrote this book about my 20s. There's something like, I understand the sort of inherent comedy of someone in their early 30s writing a memoir, but it's a pretty non-traditional memoir. It's, I didn't write about my childhood or really anything up to the point of being 25 and trying to find work. I wanted it to be a personal story, and that's sort of the genre available. But sorry, I'm now blanking on what the question is I'm actually supposed to answer. Is it about the usefulness of personal narrative in describing this world, or why I just personally decided to go for it?
Yeah, I think many people are afraid to make it personal. And I think one of the things I got from your book was how swept up we get in the momentum of this public spectacle of Silicon Valley. And design, I think, is part of that. You know, we're futurists, we're optimists. Like that kid said, it was hard to get used to that optimism. And I think you were able to have a foot in it and write about it with candor, but also take a step back and look at what it meant sort of intergenerationally. And in terms of Silicon Valley's own momentum, and just to be personal and public to me is that you talk about, for example, a workplace that's overrun by male confidence. And in this beautiful phrase, you talk about it for yourself as immersion therapy for internalized misogyny. And you weren't afraid to talk about this, right? So The Atlantic, in its review of your book, says about you that Weiner's real feat is exposing her own persistent failure to register the big picture. So that's not an apologist thing, that's a reality check thing. And I think I was very drawn in by what they call your ringside seat to what was going on, that you were in it. You talk very, very sweetly at one point about the fact that somebody says about you in a review that you're too busy learning to be doing, right? And so you're constantly inside and outside, and that to me is the most compelling way of writing. And I wonder if that was what you intended, or you just came to that, because to me that's part of your voice, and it's a voice I now want to seek out wherever I go.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. I mean, work is personal. I knew that I wanted to write about work. I didn't come to this wanting to write a memoir about my life. I knew that I had sort of, in a very Forrest Gump sort of way, stumbled into something that was important and powerful, and that my disillusionment with it wasn't unique. And so I wanted to articulate that disillusionment, but that disillusionment is also very personal, right? And I think I've always loved workplace novels. I love reading about how businesses function. I recently was reading an article from the New Yorker, I think from 1998, about McKinsey, that just like blew my mind, the way that the people speak, the sort of cool remove that a lot of them tend to operate at, the mysteriousness of what they're actually doing in these conference rooms. And I guess I wanted to articulate what I saw in my workplace, specifically the second startup that I worked for. We had 20 employees when I started, and everyone took everything so personally. It's such an emotional environment, especially when, you know, one week you feel successful and the other week it feels like a failure. And then, you know, the emotional highs and lows are as dramatic as they would be in like a dramatic early 20s relationship. And so I guess that was something I hadn't anticipated going in. I had sort of thought this was a job that was really interesting to me, but I wasn't like I was not a tech evangelist. I was not early to anything. You know, I grew up using a computer because I was born in 1987, and we had a little Macintosh, and, you know, I played KidPix, but I wasn't ever like the person who wanted to write a program like KidPix. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think that acknowledging that work is personal and emotional is important to me, and articulating also that this experience, that the sort of narrative that I was sold on was not the narrative that I lived for very long, at least. And it seemed worth interrogating that on a personal level, rather than on a sort of like polemical or thesis-driven level, just because I want to stay in my lane. That's what I'm better suited to do. But also that just was how I came to these realizations. I was naive for a long time, and I think willfully, you know, self-deluding. And so I thought that by articulating that and trying to approach it honestly, probably that was how it might resonate with other people, rather than if I kind of came down from on high and said, I figured it out, here's my thesis about this world.
Anna, when I first read the excerpt in the New Yorker that kind of introduced me to the book, and I think for the first time to your voice, one of the things that struck me, it reminded me of something really clearly. Then all of a sudden I realized what it was reminding me of was the first encounter that I had, and that most of the world had, with Anthony Bourdain, when he published an article in the New Yorker that basically explained what happened behind the scenes at restaurants. And I think all of this goes back to something Anil was saying. It's about sort of the liner notes, and about sort of, there are these vast enterprises that present themselves, with the emphasis on the enterprising vastness, and to understand that they're made up of people having individual moments, and they're flawed people and insecure people and irritating people and occasionally nice people and well-intentioned people, all contributing to these things, is sort of like really, to me, that's sort of what you were able to capture from the get-go. And one of the striking things in that article, and then ultimately in the book, is there's a very distinctive kind of voice that you have that, and a lot of people have commented on this, and I've heard interviews with you, and I know a lot of people ask about it, but you, among other things, you introduce early on kind of the habit or discipline of almost never naming a company by name, but alluding to them by some general, the social media company that everyone hated, or the online retailer that people found scary. And you're talking obviously about things that we would guess would be, say, Facebook and Amazon respectively. And the fact that he sort of anonymized them, I sort of thought was an illusion, but sort of like a kind of, kind of like a poetic allusion to kind of like the language of NDAs in a way, where, we just kind of like, I'm going to be discreet and not actually name names, but you know who I'm talking. But it also has to do with kind of throwing into relief the specific difference between, the human beings who actually, by name, face to face, and the kind of, despite the fact that brands try to have personalities, the fact that they're doomed actually just to be the product of a bunch of randomized collective intentions, and steered often just at the end of the day to making money, right? And so how did you, when you typed the first sentence, did you have that voice in your head, or did you have to kind of like work it through to kind of figure out exactly how you wanted to situate your own voice in the midst of this larger environment?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I want to just go back to what you were saying about Anthony Bourdain, which is a flattering comparison that I can't accept, but I think it sort of ties into something Anil was talking about, which is, Bourdain was writing about a culture that everyone is familiar with on one level or another, that is also a culture sort of predicated on, or that relies on a certain type of performance, and of there's sort of a curtain between the back of house and the front of house and the dining experience that people are having. And you don't know who's making your food most of the time. You might know if there's a celebrity chef associated with the menu, but it's, you are very much receiving only at the end product. And that facade is kind of necessary for the enterprise. And I think you'll see that, like, restaurants having open kitchens, it's usually upscale restaurants where the assembly and the plating is as important as the actual craft of cooking. And with software, I think that you also have this similar sort of like scrim, that the idea is to make it seem fully formed. You don't want the messiness of human life pouring out of your software app that's like antithetical to the values of software, which is supposed to be efficient and optimized and seamless. And so you have, I think it also leads to something more dangerous with software, maybe more so than restaurants, which is the sense of inevitability. This is the only way it can be. There are no other, there's nothing malleable about this because it's kind of this cold facade. And so I think that just restaurants and software, it's worth kind of turning over I'm merely mixing metaphors here, but pulling back the curtain and seeing, okay, who's actually behind this? How do they speak? What are their values in their culture? How can we actually see this as a human enterprise rather than just a final product? And so sort of tying to that, and to address the second part of your question, I did a bunch of copywriting when I worked in tech, and it was never my job. I was never paid for it, but I pitched in and did it. And the jargon really, I found that it was hard for me to write. I wanted to write fiction for a long time, and I still do. And I sort of had this idea, I'd have this tech job and I'd write short stories about like being a young woman. And my stories about being a young woman like became very stilted and sort of terrible on a literary level, because I was writing this promotional content. And even in writing my book, there were these whole sections where I was like, I'm pitching the product. I'm not describing what the software does. I'm just like slipping back into that voice. And so there is a lot of jargon in the book, but that's partly because I sort of love business speak. I love how it obscures and is redundant and is, I think it's specific. It's a language of this subculture, so it's worth speaking about and speaking in. At least for me, I think it's sort of fun, and also can be nefarious. But in terms of not naming companies, that was really more of like it's a rejection, I guess, of it's an aesthetic rejection and maybe a political rejection. I think the sort of more superficial explanation is I hate the names of these companies. I don't like I just find them embarrassing. I think, and Anil probably knows this better than I, but my assumption is that a lot of companies are named based on the availability of the domain. So
and the scarcity of vowels.
Yeah, and there are trends, there are movements in company names, but it's just, I worked for a long time across the street from a company called Splunk, and it's a data analysis company at a high level, and I assume that's drawn from the word spelunk, and spelunk is not as cute of, I don't know, but it's like, really, you're walking around when your shirt says Splunk on it. Like, I feel embarrassed, both of us. I'm sure the product's very useful. This is superficial, and I'm being a snob, but
you're talking about garbage language, which is the word you used in the book, which I love. And Molly Young, who's a big fan of yours, who writes for New York Magazine, she and I have this collection of garbage language, and we've combed your book for more examples. Michael and I, when we taught at Yale, were really adamant that our students not use jargon because jargon is a trap. But it gets to another question that Blake has asked and is getting a resounding voice of support from this group. And I had heard earlier from Alison Arieff, who has also written about garbage language, which is kind of to take yourself out of the fold that you were in when you wrote the book. Did you feel then, or do you feel now, that the kind of hierarchies that are in place, Blake talks about, not being taken seriously as a critic because you're not a founder. I've heard designers say they're not taken as seriously as engineers. That did you feel in a way, whether as a woman or I know you wrote about this, that there was misogyny, but particularly I think to Blake's question, was it sort of this founder mentality that if you weren't part of that startup culture hierarchy, you couldn't kind of cut through?
Yeah, of course, but I reject that.
and then the sort of piece of that I think that for me is underneath that question is, because I realize we're getting close on time. There's been like pushback since you wrote the book from Silicon Valley, from the people you worked with? And yeah, could you talk about that?
Sure. I guess just to the founder question, I was concerned about people, the ways that people would undermine or discredit the narrative that I was telling. It's not a flattering narrative to a lot of people. And that's part of why I wrote it as nonfiction. I assumed that if I had written it as fiction, while like potentially legally safer, I just didn't think people would take it seriously or believe me. There are just so many weird things that have happened to me as a nobody in this world that it's like the real life is stranger and also more satirical than fiction could be. And the founder thing, that was one of the things that I thought about. I'm not an engineer. I was only in the industry for 5 years. I wasn't hyper ambitious. Like, I didn't want to found my own company. But I'm not writing for those people. I think part of what I wanted to do in my book was just describe what it was like to be an ordinary person with my own unique set of circumstances. Obviously, it's not everyone who can leave the industry after 5 years and burn all of their bridges. I have qualms about that, but it's also a huge privilege to do that. And I don't feel that, I don't know, it's interesting for like an industry that claims to be meritocratic, the idea that you have to run a company in order to be taken seriously or to be considered someone with valuable input is grotesque to me. I would add to, in terms of the feedback I've gotten, I mean, it's mixed, right? I think the people that I've worked with are largely, have been really supportive, have been really generous. I think a lot of people share this feeling of disillusionment, and this is what sort of the political aspect to not naming companies, was that I wanted to highlight the ways in which these organizations are subject to structural incentives, and they occupy a structural position. And the experience that people can have when they are in a company that is shaped by the values of venture capital, or shaped by the values of a sort of like founder fetish culture. These two are interlinked. I don't mean to say that they're distinct. You can have a similar set of experiences. And so it's taking away some of the power of these companies by not naming them, but it's also saying this, you know, the company I worked for could have been any other data analytics company in San Francisco in 2013, in certain ways. And I haven't gotten a ton of direct criticism. I know that there are people who feel that the book is too cynical. There are people who feel that the book is too naive and optimistic. You know, I think because it doesn't have a core thesis or a core idea, you know, it's really what I wanted to do was just say, here's what I saw, here's how I felt about it. In some places, I think people feel that the ambiguity is not necessarily generative, but frustrating. And I've gotten criticized for profiting off the industry too, which I understand. I mean, I think someone asked me at an event, did I feel bad becoming a critic of tech when I had made money in tech? And I've been thinking a lot about that, because I have felt weird about it. But I've come to the way that I've started to think about it is actually, no, the money that I made in tech was, I was being paid for a job, to do a job, and I did the job, and the job is overvalued for sure. But that didn't buy my like fealty for the rest of my life to an industry or to a company. But I think it's complicated too, because I could see how it would be really off-putting to people. So anyway, a lot of complexities. I don't know if that's really a satisfying question. I think a lot of this can be, I don't know, I think indecision and ambiguity and ambivalence is really generative, but it's not, but it can be unsatisfying too.
Beautifully said.
It is beautifully said. I want to take, we've got a bunch of questions that I think broaden us into a group conversation for the last segment of things, but I do want to take a moment for everyone. I'm going to unmute you again. Use it cautiously, use your power responsibly. Let's take just a couple of seconds of gratitude for Anna, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna.
Anna.
Hey, thanks.
That was amazing.
Thank you.
So I've got some questions that I'll offer up, and I'll unmute all four of our panelists, lest you not be able to. Anna and Anil, Tim asks and has some curiosities of what you think or what your thoughts are on Animal Crossing and its impact right now on COVID and stay-at-home orders, but more broadly, kind of any thoughts on how gaming is not being lumped into tech, or maybe that's his assumption, and why that might or might not be?
Sure, Anna. I have a lot of thoughts, but try and be concise.
That's a great question. I actually don't have that many thoughts. I'm not in the Animal Crossing discourse. I don't really pay a ton of attention to gaming. I mean, I do think when we talk about tech, generally we're talking about IT, we're talking about information technologies, communication, business technologies, software, and gaming does tend to be outside of that, as is, you know, Netflix, other entertainment, and biotech and robotics and hardware. I guess one thing I would sort of, if I'm going to pass this over to Anil, but one thing I might add to Anil for this question is when you were talking about Facebook earlier and how people think about this and the frustration around, you know, product teams not implementing things that have been obvious to users for decades. One of the things that I am grappling with is the ways in which a moral position or an ethically motivated organization can be in conflict with the incentives of a platform, the incentives of a business model. And I wonder if that's relevant to gaming, and maybe I don't know enough about gaming to know. So sorry, just adding more questions to the
No,
fire.
hugely so. So there's a lot of super interesting things about Animal Crossing, and I'll sort of, my lens on this is my wife has played for like 15 years, and then my son, now they play together. So like it's very omnipresent in my house. I've never played the game. But in my lens on the world, it is ubiquitous. Like it is the everyday conversation. Like there's a Slack channel in our company that is just people talking about their Animal Crossing games. And so there's a couple things to know. Gaming is different from mainline, like social media and IT tech in a lot of ways. One of which is it's fundamentally a creative discipline, but also the way the industry is organized actually fits a lot more the sort of film production model. They're really big on opening weekends. A lot of the people who do the work creatively don't get credit. A lot of those organizations disband. And actually, in a way, it's much more brutal even than Hollywood is, where gaming developers and designers are frequently overworked in crunch time to meet a deadline and then sort of summarily dismissed. So it is actually, and that's a big contrast to Silicon Valley, where the sort of the cliche is they're like, you have free snacks and, everybody's got free massages at Google and all that kind of stuff. So that is, I think, fundamentally different. Also, tellingly, one of the key things here, Animal Crossing is a Nintendo game. Nintendo is actually very different even than the rest of its industry. There's these games that are sort of unique to its platform and to its context and its business model that are, Nintendo more closely resembles, for example, Apple than it does Sony or, Microsoft's Xbox team or whatever. So like there's a really interesting thing business-wise, but then culturally is where this is super interesting. So Animal Crossing, to my mind, this is, people will quibble about this, is not a game, it is a toy. And what that means is it is not a thing you win, it is a thing you play with, right? And so the difference between a top versus, or a ball versus, Monopoly or something. And so that's really, really important because it speaks to a completely different emotional, psychological motivation that is perfect for a time when we're at home, perfect for a time when we look for a passive way to connect with people that is not synchronous Zoom calls. Like it checks a lot of things culturally that are incredibly important. And one of the things you'll find when people talk about Animal Crossing, it is a toy that is about having dialogues about economics. That's extraordinary, right? So you've got a, raccoon that is a landlord. Like there's a lot of complexities that you're like, you don't want to go too deep on it, but fascinating. And the lens on it for me is like, we see on Glitch, people build apps about like whatever they're excited about. So like we see, one of the big things a couple of months ago was BTS fans saying like, ours is the best K-pop group. So we're gonna build apps to show like how many people are listening to their songs. And so like the last month has been people building Animal Crossing apps. So I look at that, I'm like, what are they building to sort of share with each other culturally? And there's a ton of like stock markets. The price of turnips has gone up today and you want to be able to track that. I'm like, I don't know what that means, but okay, that's clearly very important. And then just as many that are like, how do you pick the right name for your island in the game? And how do you understand what the birthday is of an animal there? These are like parasocial interactions around like animated, cartoon dogs and stuff, right? And so I love that. Like, I think that is a perfect use of technology. And Nintendo is really, really meticulous around cutting off every common avenue of harassment, abuse. Not to say it doesn't exist there, but there are not going to be roving bands of Nazis in Animal Crossing, right? So like there's this really, really good intentional design. And also routinely, you have adults and children playing together, not just the same household. So like, my wife will play with our friend's kid. And there's like, how many places in physical space, period, is there a way for an adult male presenting person to interact with a child in a way that both parties and their parents and everybody feel comfortable about? Almost none, right? And yet this is a thing where that happens routinely in a dialogue about economics with a toy. I think that is like, if all tech was that, the world would be massively better. And I'm sure there's bugs and problems and complaints in it, but like, I can't say enough good things about it. This is the power of intentional design. They think at a very deep level. What are they encouraging? What are they rewarding? And what will generatively happen out in the world, right? And so the fact that like people's interaction is like, let me teach you, and literally people are like, let me teach you concepts about economic bailouts through using Animal Crossing. I was like, that is a triumph. That is great art.
I've got a question that maybe we can sort of talk about as we go, because I'm really curious about this, particularly given the context we're all connecting with now. And I'll start with Anna, but I think both of you will have thoughts, I'm sure. Anna, when you wrote when you wrote the book and you had that experience, the idea that in the spring of 2020, we would all be, going through the consequences of a global pandemic, unless I missed it, it's alluded to nowhere in your book, right? So your predictive powers were not, great there. I mean, how do things look different to you now? I mean, how has, as an observer of tech culture, what do you think has changed, and will those changes, be lasting, and are they negative? Are they positive? What do you think as a observer today in May 2020?
Yeah, it's something I'm thinking about a lot. I don't know that I have a fully formed opinion. This is where I sort of want to, whenever people ask me for projections about tech, I'm like, I'm just a memoirist. I'm not a futurist, but I'm nervous in this moment. I have to say, I mean, I think like a lot of people, I'm grateful for technology. It's allowed me to check in on people. It's allowed me to stay in touch with people. And, the iPhone feels more like a miracle than it ever did. But I am nervous about the potential for further consolidation of power, for diminished transparency, for people for whom there's very little accountability already, to act in ways that are opaque and have massive repercussions and are sort of brazenly flaunting rules of civic society. I don't know. I'm nervous. I don't have concrete ideas for what might happen, but I do think that the increased dependency on very few companies is something to be alarmed about, even while we can express gratitude and relief that we have them in this moment. And I think, one obvious example is Amazon. Amazon in the middle of a pandemic is being cagey about how workers are being treated. It's, and that's putting it nicely. I think that their systems of exploitation are being revealed anew to some people, which is a positive thing, but these companies have so much power, and it's also exposing the extent to which they have really embedded themselves in people's lives, and the extent to which there aren't as many robust alternatives as one might hope. But Anil might be able to speak to this in a more specific way.
I think you articulated that masterfully. I mean, I think those are the fundamentals. There's a huge risk here, and I am torn. I mean, I think my mother had set up a Zoom call with family, in our case, across 3 continents, and to have people in Mumbai and have people in New York and California talking to each other. And she's like, why didn't we do this 10 years ago? This is incredible. Why didn't we just do this all the time? And I think that was that promise. Tech was going to do this. It was going to bring us closer together, and we were going to be in touch, and we're going to, again, I'm dating myself, but in the 90s, early 90s, they had these AT&T ads. You will, someday you'll talk to your family live around the world in real time. And there was a promise that was made 30 years ago that now is real at a time of need. And that is meaningful. And I don't fault people that make tech for feeling yeah, we did a good thing, and that's there. And then at the same time, you talk about the labor issues at Amazon. I think it goes even deeper. I mean, I think I've been working on a lot. I live in Manhattan, and we got kids on the Lower East Side that are completely disconnected from their schools. They in NYCHA housing, even if you had internet access, your Wi-Fi is not going to work. That's our public housing here in New York, and it's such a there's so many layers of barriers to this thing, and the people making decisions are like us in this conversation, who are oh, I'll just get on Zoom and do my $1,000 laptop, and it's a very there's a lot of assumptions made about what learning is going to be, what fundamental access to the social safety net is going to be, and we'd already in the physical space abdicated so much of that to our public libraries with no additional funding, or to McDonald's as the place to provide Wi-Fi. And now we don't even have that. And so I think the risk is even higher than it seems. And I'm torn because I kind of feel that in my bones, and I see that with kids in our neighborhood. And then as many of you will know, there's this conversation around contact tracing that Google and Apple have put together a proposal around, and everybody's mistrust is totally justified. I mean, digital surveillance, especially for the most vulnerable people, has been a nightmare and caused so many harms. But you know, I'm a geek, I'm a technologist. I read the proposal, I read the spec, and it's pretty damn good. Like, it's actually really good about privacy. It's actually really good about not storing data. It's actually, the analogy I would use is like, you've all, I'm sure, heard of like the dudes who are wildly obsessed with blockchain and Bitcoin and these kinds of things. And the truth of it is that math can let you do certain things that are counterintuitive. In their case, that is like a ledger that no one person owns instead of a bank owning it. And in this case, it is to be able to have reliable information about who's been exposed to whom without there being one central database. It is mathematically possible, and they've based their work on that. And so, like, at a geek level, I was like, this is an elegant solution, like, which is like the highest praise programmers can offer each other. But also, I realized I do not trust this administration politically to oversee that. I do not trust the same local governments that have failed us in providing the safety net to keep my neighbors safe to provide it. I don't trust conventional medical companies to have the fluency to be able to create it. And I really struggled with, and actually, and there's a bright line distinction. I don't trust Google data at all. I trust Apple a lot. They make a lot of really interesting choices. And the fundamental reason is their business model. They make money on selling us glass and boxes, and you know, Google makes money on selling data about us. But they both have incredible, you know, incredibly technically fluent people. And what I realized was, as critical as I've been, these were the cultural institutions, the social institutions I trusted most to create a system that might let people back out into the world. And that floored me. It really messed with my head, honestly, because I was like, you know, the question from my side, did you sell out and they brainwashed you because they wrote a nice white paper about a topic? You know, I think that was sort of my first level of like, you're just smitten by the technology. But I thought about, like, culturally, what we have lost in accountability in almost every public institution is the role of shame, right? And you grew up in an Asian household, you're pretty fluent in this, right? And so at the federal level, there's nothing you can say about them that will shame them. And so there is no control except for nominally, you know, regulation or policy, which is not being enforced. And so that's not there. And that's true of a lot of, you know, institutions. And because they're so obsessed with being seen as the good guys in Silicon Valley, shame still works in some ways because they just want you to think they're good and they're nice. And so that is a check where, if people, as they have found shortcomings in this implementation of this critical technology, they're like, oh, let's rush to fix it, because they don't want the shame of like, we were the bad guys again. They've really taken to heart, I think, and a criticism like yours and some of the others that have raised, they've taken it to heart where they're like, not moved enough to like, we're going to change structural systems of inequity. They're not like, you know, the revolution begins with us. But on the other hand, if they're like, there's a bug we can fix and it's software, they're all over it. We don't want to be creepy, you know, about tracking infection data. So I think that's something where it stayed with me a while. Like, it actually, in a weird way, brought me back to my optimism about tech, which was, all the faults aside, all the legitimate criticisms aside, can this be the thing that they do to 1% redeem themselves by taking the thing that only they can do, that we all have this piece of glass in our pocket, and actually try and help save some people's lives?
I think that that note of optimism is that hint of optimism is a wonderful place to wrap up today. Anil and Anna, this has been, I think, everything that we hoped for when we reached out to you. Let's stay visible rather than audible this time, and just give a sign of gratitude to Anil and Anna. Also to our hosts, Jessica and Michael, thanks as always for creating this space. The Design Observer team that makes all this happen, Betsy Verdell and Blake Eskin, thank you for all you do. And I want to note the 5 Timers Club, of which there are only 4 of you. Sherry Wasserman, Emma Steinhobel, Catherine Cowart, and Carl Smith have all been with us each and every week. So thanks to all of you. One note I'll make, we had about a dozen Design for America students with us, or alumni with us this week. It's an incredible college-based program The net proceeds from these sessions, you're paying a small fee to join us. The net proceeds go to Design for America. So I just want to say with gratitude that those students that were able to join us and be part of things, and it's a worthwhile program if you're looking for something to support in the design world. Thanks to all of you for taking the time to join us this week and every week as well. And I'll turn it back over to Jessica and Michael to say good night, say good afternoon.
Good afternoon, good night. Wonderful of you all to stay. We couldn't have asked for a better group. Thank you for your generous questions and comments. We'll stay in touch with you and let you know when we're doing this again, hopefully in 2 weeks. Michael, would you like to say goodbye?
Yeah, I'm just going to say talk to you next time, Jessica, and talk to all of you next time as well.
Stay home, stay safe. Thanks, everybody.
Wash your hands. Thanks.
Thank you. This was such a pleasure.
Thanks,
Yeah, thank
Anna.
you so
Thanks,
much.
everyone. Bye-bye.